The protagonist of the story, seemingly being a monster himself, is tasked to slay a princess instead of saving her, who is trapped in a basement of a cabin. The heroic nature of the protagonist tries to save the princess, and the narrator of the story, a voice heard by the protagonist, insists that the princess should be slain, with what the protagonist not knowing is that maybe he himself is the true prisoner, forced to slay a princess he doesn't know, and is tasked not to know or even speak to. Hi folks, I'm R, your narrator, and welcome to Slay the Princess. In this video I will discuss all of the endings which do become very strange and make the story very ambiguous. Keep in mind that this video will have spoilers, and with that said, let's begin. I highly recommend you watch the previous video as it contains the story and the main ending of the game. I will only quickly go over the story and the ending to summarize what happened so far. The protagonist of the story, having a monstrous form himself, is instructed by an assertive and controlling voice known as the narrator to go to a cabin in the middle of the woods and slay a princess bound by chains in its basement, as if he doesn't do so, it would bring the end of the world. As the protagonist goes through a trail perfectly designed to lead the way to the cabin, he finds a knife conveniently placed there for such a deed. The protagonist, without much hesitation, picks up the knife and lunges at the princess as soon as he sees her, killing her in cold blood. As the protagonist decides to leave the cabin, having had completed his mission, he notices in awe that he, alongside the cabin, have been teleported into a void disconnected from the forest and the world. That's when he is told by the narrator that he has completed his task and is relieved from his duties, in a way being decommissioned, thrown into a void, away from the world, but still alive, having eternal life in the cabin. The protagonist, achieving immortality, becomes a celestial being, forgetting the concept of time and space, his own presence, with the voice of the narrator even fading slowly, just becoming a pure form of existence. To many, this might seem a far worse fate than just death, but for the protagonist, a game character that has been decommissioned, this can be seen as a reward. But to the narrator's surprise, the protagonist has human qualities despite his design of being a monstrous being. He's accompanied by different voices, with one known as the hero who questions the guidance of the narrator. Deciding against the decision of the narrator to stay in the cabin and achieve the good ending, listening to the voice of the hero who urges the protagonist to get out of this hell and disobey the narrator, a controlling and manipulative entity who seems to be wanting to rule the fate of the protagonist, he asks the hero on how he could possibly escape the void. The hero suggests the formidable act of using the knife that was used against the princess, and this time to take his own life in order to get out of this place.
Do you hear that? It wants to take this happiness away from you. It wants this wonderful place to end. Do you not? There's more for us to do, and the only way for us to do it is to take that blade and use it. Don't you dare. You are absolutely correct. Using the blade to kill yourself would kill you, and you shouldn't do it. In a sense, we die, but looking at things from another angle, are we even really alive anymore? This place, it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. It's just the same thing, constantly, forever. Whatever. For the first time since time stopped meaning anything, you throw open the door to the basement and walk down the stairs. Princess's body is dust and bones, though the blade you used to slay her is still as pristine as the day you first held it.
He notices that the princess's corpse has reduced to bones and dust, barely being recognizable, which confuses both him and the hero to how something like this would be possible in just a few moments. Maybe it's the effects of the void and how time passes differently, or maybe because the character of the princess was decommissioned and not needed for the story anymore, her corpse started decomposing in a rapid speed. The protagonist, determined to end this miserable fate, picks up the knife and plunges it deep into his own heart, when the narrator, in a cold tone, explained that this is the end. As the screen goes to black, second chapter is unlocked, known as The Spectre, with the protagonist yet again finding himself in the beginning of his journey, being in the middle of the forest on the trail to the cabin.
My tricks? What on earth are you talking about? We've just met for the first time, you and I. If he doesn't remember what happened, then maybe it's best to keep it that way.
Confused to how this is possible, unsure if he repeated this or not, he questions the narrator that this feels like a déjà vu, that he killed the princess already and he died himself. The narrator dismisses this as a delusion and that the protagonist is mistaking, when the voice of the hero is heard again, who informs the protagonist that there's no hope discussing this any further, as the narrator seems to have forgotten what happened. After all, he is created as a voice of guidance for the protagonist, and he needs to lead the protagonist to his ultimate fate. Another voice is then heard by a character known as Colt, who explains that they killed the princess once before, and it wouldn't be any different now.
Oh, is there another one of us in here? I've always been here. I've just gotten a little louder. And I'm ready for all of us to have a marvelous time.
This portrays that all the voices are within the protagonist's head, apart from the narrator, with the voice of the Colt being heard this time alongside the hero, as the protagonist showed indifference while killing the princess, killing her in cold blood. As the protagonist goes to the cabin alongside the voices, he notices the interior of the cabin to be much different, in a dilapidated state, with all the wallpapers coming off. The knife, however, still remains on the table, which the protagonist is unsure to take or leave behind this time, as he knows he shares a similar fate to the princess, being a prisoner in this isolated segment of the world, a place where each person's role is defined and they are bound to it. Just as the protagonist is contemplating, he witnesses in horror the body of the princess float up through the floorboard, being the astral embodiment of the princess, which terrifies the hero. The Colt, on the other hand, acts indifferent and sarcastic, dismissing the ghost as something powerless.
A ghost? Oh, wow. How absolutely terrifying. What's a ghost supposed to do to us?
Oh, it's you. Hiya, killer. I guess we've got some things to talk about, haven't we? Like how you murdered me?
That's when the princess still remembers the previous loop, recognizing the protagonist, referring to him as a killer, intending to discuss what happened when the story comes to an end. This shows how the previous loop actually happened and that the princess was in fact murdered, being now reincarnated as a ghost, a direct result of the protagonist's action from the previous loop. In an alternate ending, the protagonist decides to hold back and study the princess a little bit before killing her, as after all, she seems to possess supernatural and hostile abilities of turning into a ghost after her death, able to roam the world and engage with live people. The protagonist, still cautious yet intrigued and scared, goes to the basement with a knife, staring at the princess instead of lunging at her. The princess in return stares back, demanding the protagonist to drop his knife. The protagonist, adamant to hold onto his knife in case anything goes wrong, the princess becomes hostile, which makes the protagonist lunge at her to stab her just like before. This time, however, the protagonist is shocked to how agile and quick the princess is, easily dodging his attacks and encountering him with powerful blows he's never felt before, hits that feel like sledgehammers raining down on him. As the protagonist, bewildered and shocked to how powerful the princess is, losing a battle which he knew he should have won, he lies down on the ground broken when she finishes the job and squeezes life out of his lungs. As the narrator explains that this is it, with screen going to black, the protagonist awakens yet again in the forest, back on the trail to the cabin. Confused to what is going on, the narrator goes on repeating the same lines that he's there to slay the princess. Knowing too well, asking the narrator won't give him any answers, he goes on the trail, reaching the cabin. That's when another voice is heard, known as the Broken, a pessimistic entity explaining how there's no hope for the protagonist and that the princess will easily kill him.
I have one last warning for you. She will lie, she will cheat, and she will do everything in her power to stop you from slaying her. It's not her lies that'll stop us. I must admit, I'm a little worried about going back in there. I don't want to be as much of a downer as my new roommate, but we were definitely outclassed last time. She seems more demon than princess.
Hero agrees with the voice of Broken, displaying how these voices are in fact external representations of the protagonist's thoughts, given prominence in accordance to his current and last encounters and situation. As he goes to the cabin, he notices how the interior has yet again changed, with no visible windows. As he goes down, he comes across a transformed princess, much larger than before, being 7 to 8 feet tall, clearly outmatching the protagonist. With the hero and Broken both being pessimistic and scared, the princess demands the protagonist to free her, as she might just let him live for a little while. This clearly shows how the princess molds and changes based on the protagonist's previous decisions and encounters with her. The protagonist, being back in the forest yet again, goes to the basement once more, but without taking the knife, this time deciding to listen to the princess, both being intrigued and scared. The princess becomes more friendly instantly, happy to answer the protagonist's questions. As they speak, the princess raises some logical and critical questions about the people who have instructed him to slay her. The protagonist, only being instructed by the narrator who provided him with no specifics and no explanation, is speechless, unable to justify his actions and purpose of being here. In return, the princess also acts very strange and provides no specifics when asked certain questions. She explains that she's been locked here in the basement as long as she remembers, with no one attending her, which confuses the protagonist and the hero to how she survived without food and maintaining herself. When asked what her name is, the princess seems to also struggle remembering her own name, just simply referring to herself as a princess, as if being just a character designed for the purpose of what she is, a princess locked in the basement for someone to rescue, or in this case, slay. The protagonist, unsure about his own existence and his life before being in the forest, decides to help the princess, going up to find something to break the chain with. As he does so, the door to the basement shuts with the sound of someone locking it. The protagonist, starting to realize he's just another pawn in the story, being controlled to what moves he should take, he goes back to the princess, discussing on how to escape. The princess, without much hesitation, starts to bite into her own wrist, trying to free herself by biting it off, when the knife from upstairs suddenly drops to the basement as if teleported here, with the narrator acting pushy to the protagonist to slay the princess while he can. The protagonist, being at first reluctant, cuts her hand off as quick as he can, shocked to see the princess not even flinching, being completely unfazed as if she is an actual monster. As both decide to go up and break the door, the narrator explains that he cannot let the princess go into the world, breaking the rules and unveiling the true nature of the story, that the protagonist is indeed controlled, only having the illusion of free will. The narrator all of a sudden changes the premise, narrating on how the protagonist picks up the knife and attacks the princess from behind. The protagonist can still show resistance, but ultimately gives in to the narrator's premise. The princess, noticing how the protagonist has changed his approach and behavior, engages in a fight with him, which ultimately brings the protagonist to his knees, with the princess ending his life.
We could have gotten out of here together. Were you just lying to me this whole time? I don't know what's come over you, but if I have to kill you, then I'll kill you. Do you think I need both of my arms to do that?
Do you hear the conviction in her voice? She pounces on you with the same animal ferocity she used to tear through her arm. But you have a weapon. You raise the blade, digging it under her ribs, aiming directly for the heart. It's not enough to stop her. You feel her claws in your throat, then her teeth, somehow sharp enough to pull apart your flesh and sinew with ease. You collapse to the floor, your body unresponsive as your blood pools on the ground beneath you. She stares down at your ravaged form, eyes shining in the darkness, dress stained in red as her blood and yours both seep into the fabric. If we're lucky, the wound you managed to... It can't just end. As much as I'd prefer for things to have gone differently, and I can't deny the reality of what's happened. I'm sorry, but it's over. Everything goes dark, and you die.
As the screen goes to black, the protagonist finds himself yet again back in the forest, with there seemingly never being an end to the story. This time, a new character by the name of the Obsessed appears, showing obsession in taking revenge and killing the princess, seemingly being a bloodthirsty entity created in response to what happened in the previous encounter. Going down to the basement, the protagonist observes how the princess has turned into a beast with sharp teeth who growls at the protagonist, calling him a traitor and a monster, who betrayed her, with her ending up in the basement, which clearly refers to the previous encounter. In this ending, when the narrator changes the premise, forcing the protagonist to stab the princess after freeing her, the protagonist resists and warns the princess about what's happening. The princess manages to easily evade his attacks, seeing how he's struggling to fight back against himself, which makes her appreciate him, but ultimately end his life very quickly to save herself. This brings the protagonist back to the forest again, with the narrator repeating his narration of the narrative. A new character reveals himself, being the voice of doubting, being sarcastic, and being untrusting of the narrator.
Yes, don't believe a word she says. Just go in, take the knife, and do what you're supposed to. Wink. Did you just say the word wink out loud? No, I didn't. Wink. Just ignore this clown and focus on the princess.
Hello? Is someone there?
You're playing a dangerous game by coming here unarmed. It's even more hypnotizing than before. Is it more hypnotizing than before, or is that just what we want it to be? I think we're in love. For everyone's sake, you're not in love. Just don't let her charm you. It's all part of the manipulation.
As the protagonist goes to the cabin and heads to the basement, the princess's voice is echoed through the staircase yet again, with the hero falling in love, saying how her voice is more hypnotizing than before. A stereotypical hero falling in love with the princess they come to rescue and have a happy ever after. The voice of doubting mentions, however, that this is something the hero imagines and wants to hear, hearing the voice of the princess in a different way. This all points out to how each character is the way they're supposed to be, the narrator narrating the story as it should be, the hero acting like a cliché in fairy tales, the other voices also acting with their corresponding duties, doubting being doubtful, obsessed being obsessive, broken being a downer, and cold being indifferent. As the protagonist goes to the basement, he notices how the princess has changed in a more feminine and innocent way, having more prominent features. The princess mentions how she remembers the protagonist, asking if he's going to help her, which depicts how she transformed into a damsel in distress, waiting for her rescuer, and all being a direct result of the last encounter on how the protagonist wanted to help her. In this ending, if the protagonist decides to leave the princess behind, neither helping or killing her, he notices how she instantly becomes hostile and threatening, saying how she can easily slip through her chains. Wondering whether she's bluffing or not, as she required the protagonist's assistance breaking out of her binds before, he doesn't take any chances and rushes to the cabin, placing the heavy table against the basement door. as he fully knows he cannot escape into the forest, being placed in a void now, a separate story that is independent of other fairy tales in the world of the game. The protagonist sits in the corner of the cabin, with the princess in fact slipping out of her chains and savagely banging on the door, intimidating the protagonist to open it for her.
I know you're still there. Why don't you make things easier on yourself and let me out? It's not like this little door will hold for very long anyways. It's probably a good idea to try to get back on my good side.
She sounds terrifying. Like she's less of the princess you saw and more like something out of a nightmare.
Her voice has changed into a multitonal way now, as if she is an interdimensional being able to teleport from world to world. The protagonist in fear shuts his eyes and goes into a deep sleep, awakening after some time, noticing in horror how the door has been broken open. As the protagonist tries to reach for the knife, he witnesses in disbelief the princess having turned into a glitching monstrosity, appearing in waves and being horrifying. The protagonist being numb, with the narrator narrating the facts, upholding his duties, the princess lunges at the protagonist and ends his life. This is far from over, as he finds himself back in the forest, being instructed by the narrator to go to the cabin and slay her.
Oh god, we can't go in there. Do either of you feel sick? Because I feel sick just thinking about that place. We're going to die.
As he tries to do so, a new voice is heard, voice of Meek, showing a different side of the protagonist, how afraid and submissive he is now, all in response to what he witnessed before. Nonetheless, he goes to the cabin, noticing that there's no more door, just a frame, with all the voices being afraid, including the hero and even the narrator. The narrator is even unsure at this point, asking someone that this isn't how things are supposed to go, with her being just an ordinary princess, for her to die. Outside of the cabin, certain entities are observed, celestial beings whom seem to be out of reach, but entities who seem to have full control over this world. That's when the princess, being an interdimensional entity, appears, glad that the protagonist is here, asking how many times she can play with him until he breaks when she ends his life yet again. This portrays how the protagonist is stuck in a loop, repeating his doomed fate, being toyed with by the princess who has transformed into a being that the narrator is even unsure of. This reveals how leaving the princess chained in the basement was not part of the premise, and doing so completely broke the game, making the princess an entity that shouldn't exist. That is why killing the princess was important, as despite her guilt or lack of any, this was written in the story, and if it doesn't go as it's supposed to go, the world of the story breaks, transforming the princess in different ways in accordance to the protagonist's actions. The final ending here reveals much more of the story, as the protagonist finds himself yet again in the forest, slowly starting to lose his mind on how everything is pointless. He decides to leave his mission and avoid the cabin.
You're really keen on wasting everyone's time, aren't you? It's remarkably selfish, if you ask me. I've already outlined the stakes of the situation. If you don't do your job, everyone dies. Like, dies. Forever. When I said everyone, I meant everyone. That's a pretty large group to just condemn to death over a single princess. And, last I checked, you're part of everyone too, so if you think about it, walking up to that cabin and slaying her is really in your best interests as well.
As he takes a different path despite the narrator's instructions and persistence, he finds himself magically back on the same trail. The protagonist, starting to realize he's as trapped as the princess, doomed to have the same fate, he takes the opposite direction to the trail when he finds himself in front of the cabin. Shocked to this experience, the protagonist stays adamant, deciding to explore the forest as long as he could, avoiding the cabin. As he does so, his vision starts to go blurry, with his head getting pulsating pain, getting flickers of light in the corner of his eyes. That's when he finds himself in a surreal position, seeing multiple clones of the cabin, all having identical trails, when the narrator explains that there's no escape and these cabins are all the same, all leading to a basement with the same exact princess being imprisoned within. The narrator explains that the protagonist is placed here in this fraction of world to do what he's supposed to do, to slay the princess in order to save the world. As the protagonist is still steadfast in his decision, he outmaneuvers the cabins, wandering further and further into the forest, which seems to be surrounded by cabins when he loses concept of time, with the screen going to black. This time, the protagonist notices a large wall drawing around the forest and the cabin, revealing how he is a prisoner to the plot as much as the princess. A voice is then heard, known as the Contrarian, acting in contradiction to the narrator, saying the exact opposite, which was created from the reluctance of the protagonist going to the cabin. However, knowing full well he doesn't have any other choice, the protagonist goes to the cabin, which has a deformed interior with the table being out of proportion. When he decides to go to the basement, in confusion and awe, observing the princess being completely deformed, with her voice and tone even sounding deformed and incomplete.
Don't be a stranger. It's been so long since I had a friend.
That's when the story comes to an end, with the screen going to black. This in a way showed how leaving the cabin, something that was not expected of the protagonist to do at all, contradicting the premise of the story, the entire fraction of the world deformed, including the princess, which in a way broke the reality of the protagonist, his voices, the narrator, and the princess. All the characters were given their corresponding roles in the story, seemingly written by celestial beings who observed the protagonist. Contradicting the story would break the world, as there would be no order anymore. That's why when the protagonist completed his mission, he would simply get thrown into a void, detached from the rest of the world in the game, as he is not needed anymore. All the characters and beings around him also come to a stop, as this fractional part of the world were only written for their corresponding short lifespan. Nothing in the story mattered, no specifics were given, no one had a name or a life apart from their roles in the story, as nothing more was written about them. The story is the sad reality of the characters' attempts to live a different life and outlive their predestined fate, but no matter what, they find themselves back where they started. The protagonist being back in the forest to slay the princess bound in the basement to be slain, and the narrator back narrating the story and trying to lead it where it needs to go. Any slight changes to any aspects of these, catastrophical changes occur, with new voices being heard and the princess glitching. And despite all that, the premise still remains unaltered, with the protagonist tasked to slay the princess and the princess tasked to be slain. And after that, the protagonist should just exist in the cabin, being fully decommissioned. And that's it for the end of this video, folks. If you enjoyed it, you can stay tuned for more by hitting on the subscribe button and the notification bell. If you also have any video or game suggestions, you can DM me or tag me on my Twitter. It's been your host Star, and as always, I will see you on the next one. Take care.